Добрый день, Sudesi. Once again, welcome to our live stream on Inside Ukraine with me, Connor Klein. We got the iconic Odessa Opera House. And this summer, sunshine. It has been an absolute scorcher here. And it has been a bit of a scorcher for Russian oil facilities in the last few days, where we saw on the first day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Ukraine striking the oil terminal in St. Petersburg, as well as a corvette on Kronstadt Island, if I'm not mistaken. So they also were feeling the heat over there in the Muscovite Empire. And on today's live stream, we're going to examine the escalation options that Vladimir Putin has as he finds himself losing, quite clearly losing in this Russo-Ukrainian war. New to this channel, my name is Connor Klein. The background in international relations. I've been living in this region for over 10 years, speak both Russian and Ukrainian. At least my Ukrainian is getting a lot better. And I'm here to give you a more unique insight into the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war, quite literally on the ground here in Odessa. So Vladimir Putin, as I've been saying since second half of 2023, that he would face his problems in the second half of 2025, and we've seen that come to fruition, and that is he has a problem with manpower, material, and money. His economy is not quite collapsing, but it's in a pretty bad state. They are losing more soldiers on the front lines than they can replace them with, and they've burned through their Soviet era stockpiles. Of course, they're producing new material as well, and missiles and rockets and a certain number of tanks, but the production isn't enough to replace their burn rate, or what has been traditionally. The tactics have also changed recently, where they use less infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, but at the same time, they're now apparently requested the Taliban to send them the Soviet tanks that were left behind when they abandoned. That must be about 40 years ago. So, yeah, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. That means they've actually run out of their Soviet stocks that they can actually refurbish at this point. So, on the front lines, it's not a stalemate. Russia's making small amount of progress in Donbass, but it's very piecemeal, and the Ukrainians are actually taking back some territory in Zaporizhia Oblast. So it's kind of for this year a little bit. Maybe the Russians taking slightly more territory than Ukraine has taken back. But it's so small, it's glacial, it's not going to indicate that Russia's about to make a big breakthrough. And to achieve a new strategic objective, they would need to take the whole of the Donbass region. And basically, at the current pace, unless that dramatically increases, it's going to be like 5 to 10 years before they do that. So, the other problems will compound well before they can actually achieve that strategic objective. And the problem is, up until now, since 2022, we'll say, with this extended invasion, the only strategic objective that they've actually achieved is creating a land corridor between Russia, de jure, and illegally occupied Crimea. And now that is effectively under fire control from the Ukrainians because of these mid-range drones that they're using to hit the Russian supplies. So they do have an actual physical bridge to the Crimean Peninsula that was there before the invasion. That has been severely weakened, and now they don't actually transport so much of their military material through that. They actually use the land corridor, but now that's under fire control. So yeah, on paper, they still occupy it as the Ukrainians nibble away at that control, but the actual value of it strategically has been severely compromised. So it's no light at the end of the tunnel for Russia, barring a Black Swan event, at least the collapse of the Ukrainians, or some very revolutionary technological and military breakthrough that allows them to have some sudden achievement on the front lines. Russia is basically trapped in this war. It's clear to me after about 2 to 3 weeks that was going to be the case, but a bit like with Germany in World War II, it takes a few years for that to all come to the light and for the mainstream to basically realize that the war is trending in Ukraine's favor. So, caught with this predicament, and being a dictator who's been in power in the Russian Federation for, at this point, what is it, over 25 years, must be, and obviously been terrified or deeply concerned that if he loses power, what's going to happen to him. First, he doesn't want to lose power. he needs to figure out a way to end this war without losing power. And that is not so easy because if he just frees the front lines, he doesn't really have much of a strategic achievement. He has, yeah, as I said, the line corridor, but 4 years of this intense war for the biggest war in Europe since World War II, with casualties of over 1 million who've been fighting on the Russian side. Not all of them might have been actually Russians. They could have been conscripted Ukrainians and foreigners to a certain extent, but definitely huge numbers of lost life. And most importantly, the economic situation rapidly deteriorating. And then if you so, because things, well, a little bit of hay fever maybe. Excuse me. With the situation in the economy rapidly deteriorating, that is not a good formula for staying in power. So he may try to buy some time and at least try to project some power and strength through escalation. Also, he can escalate to de-escalate, which is basically escalate the situation and agree to back down in exchange for concessions, especially if you look at maybe the Achilles heels for Ukraine, which is their European allies, because the U.S. basically doesn't give much support to Ukraine, no matter what Candace Owens says, whatever rubbish she makes up when she's speaking to Russian journalists at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, not sending any money basically to Ukraine since Donald Trump took over, which is a strategic mistake by the U.S. because, well, think about what trouble Russia will be in if Kamala Harris had won. They'd still be sending support to Ukraine and probably not a start of the war in Iran, which led to the increase in the oil prices. But that's a counterfact, not the situation that we ended up living in. So basically, yeah, the election of Donald Trump most likely actually bought Putin a lot of time, at least a year, maybe even 2 years, to fight on longer. But he probably needs to escalate in some way. So we've seen already an escalation with a lot of ballistic missile attacks on Kyiv, the capital. Now, Russia's estimated to have a stockpile of 300 to 400 ballistic missiles. And the problem for Ukraine is at the moment, they don't shoot down the majority of those incoming ballistic missiles. At the moment, they claim to be shooting down about 95% of the kamikaze drones. And I can't verify whether it's 95%, but they're definitely getting most of them for sure, because you can see here in Odessa how the air defense works, and it's really successful at the moment. Of course, some get through, but considering the sheer number that's fired, somewhere north of 90% does sound realistic at the moment. However, they say they're only shooting down, I think, around 30% of ballistic missiles, and it mightn't even be that much. So they really have an issue in terms of shooting them down. Russia has a pretty large stockpile, so they could fire in the next few weeks, months, a large amount of their stockpile, probably not all of it, but a large part. So that could be hundreds of ballistic missiles. Obviously, every month they're producing a certain number as well. However, Russia can only do that in the short term because Ukraine eventually is going to have an alternative. Production is going to be ramped up, and probably they're going to develop their own version, probably in conjunction with some European partners. There are rumors that will be by the end of the year. Fingers crossed, if you're obviously going to be in Ukraine next winter, that's the case. So that is one thing that really has already been happening. Second major escalation, something I've been waiting on, and I'm surprised it hasn't happened for at least 2 years yet, and that is another mobilization by the Russian Federation. They had one back in October 2020, I think it was October, then it was autumn 2022. 1 million Russians left the country while they recruited 300,000 men to serve. So they took 300 men out of the economy directly, but ended up costing them 1.3 million. Maybe some of those men later came back, but then probably other men may have decided not to wait for a subsequent conscription as well. So that is something that Igor Girkin, the Russian ultranationalist, who's a war criminal sitting in prison, not for the war crimes, but for criticizing openly Vladimir Putin. But apparently he's strong enough still that he's still alive in prison. He said that Putin should have done this way back in the beginning, and definitely by 2024. He said doing it now will effectively not be a game changer in the war. However, it will escalate things. Russia will have a lot more soldiers coming in. They will be trained up quickly and then sent to the front lines, and that may allow them to increase. So the camera overheated there. Let me just put it back in. So hopefully that's back and not going to go off again. But I see It should still be rolling. So after that pause, that interlude, due to my camera, I've moved it, so I forgot that the sunlight here seems to be particularly strong at this hour. So Putin has tried that before. Problem now is it's probably too late. So of course it will drag the war on for longer, having that manpower coming in. However, it's going to be deeply unpopular in the Russian Federation because they've already tried that with if he's going to try it, and it probably will lead to a lot of increased unpopularity in Russia. Things are getting more difficult. Obviously, the economy is in trouble, which already upsets a lot of people. Not the fact that they're an imperialistic power that's invaded Ukraine, committed tens of thousands of war crimes, and killed who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people have died on both sides as a result. Now, they don't really care too much about that, the vast majority of Russians, but they do care, the Muscovites, about being poorer and having to go and serve in the military when they didn't volunteer. So that is something that would be high risk from Putin. The first thing, like just firing more rockets at Ukraine and using up whatever reserves they have, probably going to be popular in Russia because then they'll be able to show they're able to kill and terrorize Ukrainians. So for a certain section of the Russian population, that apparently seems to be a popular uh, course of action. And then we look at other escalation options. One would be to make nuclear threats. So rattle the nuclear saber. We've seen that before. Do I think it will work? There seems to be, well, the US is not so relevant because they're not actually supplying Ukraine or really have much influence in Ukraine at this juncture. So it would really be Europe, the European allies of Ukraine. And that did seem to have an impact with the previous German government, for example. But now Friedrich Merz is the chancellor. Might work, might not work. It's something that Russia periodically tries. So we'd expect to see that where they threaten to fire nuclear weapons just in general. Then we may see what happens if they use a tactical nuclear strike as an escalation somewhere in Ukraine. Well, it would probably at most only freeze the front lines. Like the idea that you're going to use a tactical nuclear weapon and then have a big breakthrough in the days when we have drones seems a little bit fanciful for me. That's going to punch a hole through if you're just going to have a swarm of drones that are going to come in and destroy whatever Russian armor or personnel would try to go through that hole. Plus, they would obviously be going through in a state where there's nuclear fallout. So, not so sure the Russians really actually going to find that beneficial. Downsides, of course, would be that NATO might even get directly involved. So when I say NATO, probably not the US, but under Trump, but it could be the other European allies that may say, well, if they've used nukes, they just cross the Rubicon and we need to snuff it out and ensure a Ukrainian victory in case they escalate even further. And China is definitely going to be upset. They do not want to see the use of nuclear weapons. And India, so they will end up ostracized and with less support and possibly with a more hostile European alliance against them. So, not really seeing what the upside is for using tactical nuclear weapons. The main reason of nuclear weapons is as a deterrence. Didn't work very well for the Russians with the Ukrainians occupying temporarily the Kursk Oblast. So, not really seeing that as very likely at all. But of course, it would be rather dramatic and very high risk if it were employed. Now, other escalation tactics that they can go for, they could, of course, have a second front, come down through Belarus again and attack Ukraine that way. That would almost certainly this time drag Belarus directly into the war. They wouldn't be able to get away with it, so to say, like they did back in 2022. The Ukrainians have already said that they have identified about 500 targets in Belarus that they're going to hit if Belarus facilitates another attack by the Russian Federation from Belarusian soil. So again, possibility, but probably going to backfire. And I'm not convinced that Alexander Lukashenko would go along with that. He's a bit of a wily operator, and I don't think he wants to see the Belarusian forces dragged into the war directly. So probably he's not going to go along with it. Other escalatory steps, as I've discussed a few times here in the channel, it could have a limited operation to seize a small part of a NATO member state, like Latvia, like Estonia. They may grab a village just on the border, kind of Crimea, 2014 scenario where they have no insignia on the soldiers' clothes, and Russia just denies that they know any about those people with the latest drones and Russian military hardware, and they occupy a small amount of territory. It could be Finland. It could be somewhere else that we haven't thought of. That would obviously help the additional element of surprise. And then they wait and see what the NATO allies do. Do they come to that country's aid and actually eject the Russian forces, or do they, stand around sending moral support and actually Russia is encouraged to go even further and they can demonstrate that Article 5 of NATO, in fact, doesn't work as a deterrence at that point because obviously Russia tested it. And most importantly, from a Russian point of view, they can prove that it doesn't actually work as a way to defend those European allies. And we don't know what Donald Trump's going to do. I don't think he's going to send any US troops. He may just send, he may even criticize the NATO allies that are there. Who knows what he's going to actually do in practice. So that is one escalatory step. The problem is that if he does that and they get a shellacking, those troops, like the European allies come, or just the local troops there, defeat them, then that's going to be another humiliation for Vladimir Putin. I don't think he can actually stay in power with that kind of additional humiliation, like them attacking Latvia and getting defeated and having to run back to, I guess it would be to St. Petersburg in that case. Probably he's going to lose powers. That would be very high risk, but it depends what information he's getting from his military advisors, whether that is something that is actually plausible in terms of working. I don't think it is. But then again, I didn't think that it was very wise for Russia. I described it as mad back in December 2021 if they were to have this extended invasion of Ukraine. They went ahead and did it, and it's turned out to be a train wreck. And it was clear after about 2 to 3 weeks that it would be basically a defeat for Russia, but they kept going with it for another 4 years. So don't expect Vladimir Putin to suddenly change to start making good strategic decisions when he has a history militarily of making very poor ones. So that is still an option. There are other options. He could escalate by attacking a non-NATO member state. Well, he's got a very friendly government in Georgia at the moment, so probably not going to be Georgia. However, on the other side, there is Armenia, which Russia does not have a border with, but they do have a friendly government. It's not a friendly nation in Georgia that could act like Belarus did in the 2022 Russian invasion, actually facilitate an attack on Armenia. It doesn't have to be even a military attack. It could be just a coup d'etat. That could be another escalation. Armenia at the moment is playing with the idea of moving closer to the European Union and the United States after they were, their Armenian backed forces in Nagorno-Karabakh lost control of that region. It was de jure Azerbaijani, and they took it back. And since then, since the Azerbaijanis also hit sovereign Armenian territory, de jure Armenian territory, and the Russians did not intervene to do anything about it, they don't see the value in being close to Russia anymore, and they'd rather get into the EU sphere of influence, because maybe even eventually EU membership, because that offers prosperity. And if Russia's not going to be a security guarantor for them, a bit like the European countries are facing now with the US being a very fair weather ally under Trump, then they need to look for alternatives. And that could be a way of escalating, showing a strategic achievement in terms of preventing Armenia from leaving Russia's sphere of influence. They have explicitly warned the Armenians that they face a Ukrainian situation or Ukrainian scenario, which means basically they plan to attack them, is the threat that they are making. So that could be another escalation. They could escalate somewhere else, but I don't really see a good candidate. Kazakhstan, it is flat and it is vulnerable to get to the capital, Astana. However, it just seems like it would be a very big operation. Kazakhstan is an enormous country. So, and they're not currently making a beeline to get out of Russia's sphere of influence. They're gradually decoupling from Russia. So I think strategically it would be a huge risk for them to do that one. So probably if any country they were going to try to intimidate, it's going to be Armenia. Of course, they could try and do it in Moldova, but because they have some Russian soldiers in Transnistria, but it's only 1,500 and they're isolated, and it would seem like a bit of a kamikaze mission to try and take Chisinau in any shape or form, because the Ukrainians are beside and they could snuff it out. So that would be the one country where you could see Russia escalate on as an option. These are all options that presumably Vladimir Putin has in front of him. He has his military fighters and they're running through them. They could escalate the hybrid warfare, the gray zone warfare against Ukraine's European allies with more arson, more drone attacks. We saw drone veer off into Romania. We saw the drones that weren't armed that went into Poland last year. So we see that we've seen many fires, some assassinations. So we can see that dramatically escalate. And then that would be a way of Vladimir Putin projecting power, showing the Russian public, hey, I'm able to hit these Europeans. Would that be something he could use in negotiations to try to get the European allies to stop supporting Ukraine? Not with the current leadership in the European countries. Enough of them are behind Ukraine. They've already guaranteed money for Ukraine for 2 years. So he would need political change, like some pro Kremlin governments to come to power in important European capitals. So he had one in Viktor Orban in Budapest in Hungary, but he's gone. And you see the kind of, there's no one really to replace him at the moment. However, for example, the AfD came to power in Germany, you might see a chancellor who's pro Kremlin. You could see maybe in the UK, Nigel Farage, although he seems desperately trying to distance himself from both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin at the moment, but hard to know. He's a politician. He might just be saying that to try and get elected. If there's an early election in the UK, you're going to have French presidential elections next year, and Marine Le Pen's party has been associated with receiving money from Russia in the past. So that's all possible. It's not something that is an option right now, in my opinion. It won't really change anything. It will probably just differ and resolve and encourage more support for Ukraine and less compromise with Moscow. So again, I can't predict exactly what Vladimir Putin's going to do because he's made just a huge series of mistakes in this war by and large. So maybe he'd do all of the things that I don't recommend and hasten his own demise and Russia's defeat in this Russo-Ukrainian war. So let's see what he decides to do. The other option, of course, is that he frees the front lines and suddenly agrees to meet with Zelensky and says, we're going to have a peace process. And we have a Minsk III situation where the front lines are frozen. No one's really respecting it. Both sides are arming themselves to try to get ready for the next phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war. A bit like what we saw between 2015 and 2022. You had the Minsk I and II agreements, and then you had this, I guess I don't think phony war is the right term because we had that in 1939 to think around 1940 with World War II, but they were firing on the front lines, a lot of artillery. However, front lines weren't moving really, and there wasn't attacks on the cities of either country either. So couldn't end up that situation, but both countries are going to be rearming and plotting to undermine the other with an eye to the hostilities starting again at some juncture, whether that's 1 month, 10 months, 10 years down the road, and finishing the war in a third phase. As we can say, we had the first phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war from 2014 to 2022, and then 2022 so far until 2026. So if they go for Minsk III, then will be 2026 until they restart it. So those are some of the options. Write down below if you think he's got other options for escalation. Where do you think that's what he will go for next? Which ones? Whether you think they will be successful. Let me see if there are any questions. This is a live stream, even though I managed to overheat the camera. Someone says that they don't think that the Belarusians, I don't know. I probably need to, I don't know if this original comment is in German or my camera is just telling me in German, but it's Josh. For some reason, Lukashenko, Geraska verse, wenn sie neuen Invasion. Yeah. So Josh doesn't think that Belarus will come out well if there is another invasion from Belarusian territory on Ukraine. I agree entirely. I think at that point, Ukraine will strike Belarusian military targets, whether they're Russian or Belarusian, in the country, and that will lead to a huge crisis of legitimacy for Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. Now, that would be maybe to Russia's advantage at that point, because they might try to replace him with a puppet president, Alexander Lukashenko, while he has leered to being under the Kremlin's auspices. He's not really trustworthy. He's not actually really pro-Kremlin. He's pro himself. He's a Mayfainer, as we say in Ireland. And he's basically only pro-Lukashenko and clinging on to power. So he would, if he thought he could secure power stronger and longer, he'd just do 180 and be suddenly pro-European if he could get away with that. But that's not the current situation. So that would be something for sure that Lukashenko will resist, is Russia using that territory to invade Ukraine, because he's going to get struck. He may be overthrown by his own military, or there might be some other internal coup d'etat. It could be a coup d'etat by the Russians. I think it would be hard for the pro-democratic opposition, Tikhanovskaya or other forces, like to like the Belarusians who fight in the Ukrainian army to actually take over Belarus if Lukashenko was deposed, because then there'd be Russian obviously forces there, and it would be just another battlefield in this Russo-Ukrainian war, but actually on Belarusian soil. But that's a whole kind of worms that I think Lukashenko is probably smart enough, even in his advancing age, to avoid. So it would only be if he's basically about got no other choice that he would agree to that. So definitely, for sure, I don't see that happening. I don't think it will work out very well for Belarus, and I also don't think it will work out very well for the Russian Federation either, because I think they would basically end up in another quagmire in Belarus and just extend it, and they would be kind of bogged down there. You don't know how other forces are going to react in the region. Is Poland going to back not just the Ukrainians? Well, the Ukrainians will probably back some Belarusian forces to take over towns in Belarus as well in that scenario, I would imagine, and just say that they're free Belarusian forces as opposed to the Russian-backed pro-Kremlin forces. So it could be, yeah, just thinking out that scenario and playing it out, you can end up with a real slew of different characters and groups trying to vie for power and seizing parts of territory. It could get very messy. So again, that probably wouldn't work very well for Russia, but they might try it, and definitely wouldn't work out well for Lukashenko. If you're thinking of coming here to Ukraine, I do have my guide, which is my insider's guide to coming to Ukraine during the war. Not only we get the historical background, logistical information, what's going on, you will also get my hospitality guide for my favorite cafes, restaurants, bars, clubs, and shisha lounges for cities like here in Odessa, Mama, Kyiv, the capital, Lviv, in the west of Ukraine, and two smaller cities, Uzhhorod and Chernosy, that are also popular with foreigners because they actually have very few strikes by Russian Federation. They did have one or two in the last month or so, but that's actually been rather unusual. So a lot of foreigners go there as an entry into Ukraine as well. So you can get all that good stuff. There is a link down below in the description to this live stream for that guide. So do I have any more comments on this live stream? Not so far. I think I've summed up the situation in spite of my camera overheating. And then what else happened? Something else happened with my phone, basically, today on the live stream. But if you have any comments or questions, drop them down below in the comment section if you're watching this on replay, not here live. I'll give it another minute while I enjoy this beautiful summer weather that we have in Odessa. I really need to go down to the seaside if we go to the sea. But tomorrow the weather's not going to be as nice, or on Saturday or Sunday or Monday. I think it's back Tuesday next week. We're going to be back with this fantastic weather. So you can see life going on behind me as well in Odessa. In spite of the Russo-Ukrainian war, people are doing their best to live as normal as lives as possible. And it is a time to be pretty optimistic because the war, and even the mainstream has kind of figured out that the war is trending in Ukraine's favor, and those in the know that it's been trending in Ukraine's favor for quite a while, at least for a year. So if you're thinking to come to Ukraine, this is a pretty good time to come, I would say. At least it's not the cold winter months where Russia's constantly striking the energy facilities. You can enjoy the beautiful weather, the great Ukrainian food, and the more upbeat and optimistic vibe here in Ukraine. And without the mass tourism, because there are going to be very few tourists. So, since I don't have any more comments or questions for now, I will wrap it up there. Slava Ukraini is said on my t-shirt here. From Slava and do перемоги.